All right, AP Environmental. Today we're going to start Unit 7. We've only got 3 units to go. This is a really short unit. So I would really like to maybe get through this thing before spring break. That's kind of the goal. If we can't, that's okay, but I'm going to kind of be pushing for that. So anyway, let's get started here with 7.1, which is an introduction to air pollution. Let's kind of start off today with just a simple definition, of what air pollution is. Remember, air. You got to remember the air, right? The air is a commons, right? It's something that we all share. We're all breathing the same air on this planet, so it is again kind of a global commons. But I mean, for example, if they're having air pollution in China, like some air pollution issues, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to like linger over here in the United States necessarily. But remember, I mean, all this air, is stuff that we do share. So we don't want it to be polluted anywhere on the planet, especially locally where we live. But air pollution is again, it's just the introduction of certain things to the air. They could be chemicals, they could be particulates, which are solids. We'll talk about those a little bit today. They could even be microorganisms, that get into the air. And when these things get into the air in a high enough concentration, they can do a lot of damage not only to humans, but to plants, other animals, even our infrastructure, things like buildings and bridges and things like that. And they can really have a major impact on the ecosystem. Now, there's two general categories of air pollutants. We call them either primary or secondary. Primary are things that we put directly into the air. For example, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is something that we put directly into the air, by burning fossil fuels, right? So, I mean, that would be a primary pollutant. Secondary pollutants are things that form from those primary pollutants. We're going to talk this week and next week about things that we put into the air directly, like their primary pollutants. But once they get into the air, they actually can change and turn into other things. Those would be secondary pollutants, and those can be pretty bad. So we'll talk about those as well. All right. So initially here, let's just kind of go through a list of some really bad things. All right. In 1970, the Clean Air Act, which is a piece of environmental legislation that was written to address air pollution, the Clean Air Act identified 6 things that are pretty much the worst things we could possibly put into our air. These 6 things are what we call the criteria air pollutants. All right, whenever you hear the word criteria air pollutants, there are 6 things that should come to mind. All right, I'm just going to list them here for you. We're going to talk about them individually today. Sulfur dioxide is one of them. Particulates are another, particulate matter. Lead, tropospheric ozone. We will talk about that one in great length a little bit later on this week. Nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide, not dioxide, monoxide. So these 6 things, we use this mnemonic here. It's called SPLONK. All right. S is sulfur dioxide, P is particulates, L is lead, O is ozone, N is nitrogen oxides, and C is carbon monoxide. So if you remember SPLONK, all right, just remember what each term or what each letter represents, and you'll know your criteria pollutants. Now, I'm not saying that these are the only air pollutants, okay? They're just the 6 really bad ones, okay? There are some other ones that probably come to, carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide we've been talking about all year long as being something that is a pollutant. But this one is not necessarily harmful, to like human health. So, I mean, we exhale carbon dioxide all the time. This one is more of a global issue. We'll talk about this one more in Unit 9. But these are also things that we don't want to get into the air. Mercury is another one called VOX, volatile organics. We'll talk about this one as well. But these ones aren't listed as the 6 criteria pollutants. Make sure we know what the 6 are. So let's start off with sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is chemically known as SO2. All right, it's produced anytime there's a chemical reaction that involves the burning of sulfur. So anytime sulfur combusts, it's going to react with oxygen. And we're going to get this reaction here. Okay, sulfur plus oxygen produces SO2. So anything that has sulfur in it, if we burn it, it's going to produce that SO2. So how do we get SO2? Well, one of our main things is burning fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels contain sulfur, right? Mainly we're talking about coal and diesel fuel, like for big trucks and things like that. If we burn that stuff, it has sulfur in it, and we're going to get SO2. Now, there's some other things that produce SO2, volcanic eruptions, forest fires produce SO2, but those are natural things that have been going on for a long time. Now, some forest fires are not natural; right? They are caused by humans, so that would increase the SO2. That would be more of an anthropogenic way. But again, some of those things are just natural occurring things. The effects of SO2. It is a respiratory irritant. That means that it can just get into your lungs. It really affects people with asthma. Um, this is a big one that we'll talk about a little bit later on next week. But when SO2 goes up into the atmosphere, it can turn into sulfuric acid, which is a major component of acid rain. We call it acid deposition. So sulfuric acid is a secondary pollutant. The SO2 is a primary. So that goes up into the air and it can turn into this secondary. So there's a good example of primary and secondary. It can also harm plant tissues. Now, one of the things that it does with plants, if you know anything about plant anatomy, which you probably don't, but maybe you do, in plant cells, there are certain structures. You're probably aware of chloroplasts and all that type of stuff. There's a structure called a stomata. The stomata in a plant cell is what opens and closes and allows excess water in the plant to leave and transpire. It can go up into the atmosphere. So, plants will absorb water, and they'll use it for photosynthesis. And then, if there's any excess water, those stomata will open, and that water can just evaporate and go out into the atmosphere. But then they'll close, and allow the other water to stay inside the plant. Well, the problem with SO2 is it doesn't allow the stomata to close. So that means whatever water is being absorbed, that water can be transpired because the stomata, don't allow it to stay inside. So basically, what happens is this affects photosynthesis. If plants can't store their water, then they can't photosynthesize very well. It's almost like, think about it, if you constantly sweated, just constantly, because your pores are open and they're allowing all that sweat to come out. I mean, you would dehydrate. You would get super sick from that. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. Is when these stomata are open, the water just continuously leaves the plant, and the plant can't survive that way. So this is a major problem. Our SO2 has that capability to do that to plant cells. All right, nitrogen oxides. Nitrogen oxides are also known as NOx compounds, NOx. Um, NOx compounds come in 2 different types. One of them is called nitrogen monoxide, which is NO, nitrogen with 1 oxygen. There's also nitrogen dioxide, which is NO2. Now, one of the things about nitrogen is, we learned earlier in the year when we studied the nitrogen cycle that our atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. So if any of that nitrogen in our air combusts, if it burns, then it's going to lead to the formation of NOx. It's going to lead to the formation of nitrogen oxides. So how does NOx get into the air? Again, burning fossil fuels. Remember, fossil fuels are made from plants, right? So any fossil fuel, it could be coal, oil, wood, which is a it's biomass. It could be any type of biomass, ethanol, biodiesel, anything that has nitrogen in it that comes from plants. It's going to produce NOx compounds. Okay. There's also some natural ways it can get into the air. Lightning, like when lightning strikes, it causes the nitrogen in the air to combust, and that causes it to react with oxygen. Also, bacteria in the soil can produce NOx compounds. All right, so again, some of these things, though, are naturally occurring. It's this burning of fossil fuels that's the anthropogenic thing. Down, please. Now, the effects. It's a respiratory irritant. Again, you don't want to get it into your lungs. It can be converted into something called nitric acid, which again is a secondary pollutant. That also is a component of acid rain. It can also lead to the formation of ozone. Now, some ozone is good and some ozone is bad. This is the bad stuff. And we will talk about how it forms tomorrow, actually, in the lecture. But these are secondary pollutants from NOx. So if NOx goes into the air, it forms these secondary things. All right, I'm going to stop this video here today, and I'm going to have you watch part 2 as soon as you're ready to do that. Okay. So have a good day, folks, and I will see you soon.